My name is Ava, and I am 22 years old. The night everything changed, I was 16 sitting at our dining table as my father casually told his colleagues I was the family mistake. I still remember the way my mother laughed, pointed at me, and added that birth control is only 99% effective. I was the 1%. That night, I left with $40 and a backpack. For 6 years, I built a life they knew nothing about. This morning, they showed up at my door crying. Before I dive into the most painful night of my life, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt like you didn't belong in your own family. Growing up, I always sensed something was different about how my parents treated me compared to my older brother Jackson. There was this invisible wall between us that I could never break through no matter how hard I tried. My earliest memory of this feeling comes from when I was around 5 years old. We were at the county fair and my father Brian had Jackson on his shoulders, both of them laughing as they pointed at different attractions. I kept tugging at my father's pant leg, asking to be lifted up too. He looked down at me with this expression I would come to know well over the years, a mixture of irritation and obligation, and said, "Not now, Ava. Maybe later." Later never came. My mother Diana was more subtle in her favoritism, but it was always there. When Jackson brought home a B on his report card, there would be celebrations and ice cream. When I brought home straight A's, there would be a quick nod and a distracted, "That's nice, dear." I spent years thinking maybe I just wasn't doing enough to earn their attention or love. Our family photos told the story better than words could. In almost every picture, Jackson stood proudly between our parents, their arms wrapped around him. I was usually positioned slightly to the side as if I was an afterthought, someone they remembered to include at the last second. In our living room, Jackson's school portraits and sports trophies dominated the shelves. My academic certificates were tucked away in a drawer. By the time I was 10, I had developed a detailed mental map of our household emotional terrain. I knew to be extra quiet when my father came home tired from work. I knew not to ask for help with homework when my mother was watching her evening shows. I knew which topics would make everyone smile at the dinner table, usually anything related to Jackson's latest accomplishments, and which ones would make the room go uncomfortably silent, usually anything about my own achievements. "Did you see how Jackson scored the winning goal today?" My father would beam at dinner. "He's got my athletic genes," my mother would add proudly. When I mentioned winning the school spelling bee, my father would check his watch, and my mother would suddenly remember laundry that needed folding. It was my friend Zoe who first put it into words when we were 12. We were sitting on the swings at the park near our houses, and I was telling her about how my parents had forgotten to pick me up from my piano recital. "Ava," she said, stopping her swing, "don't you think it's weird how your parents treat you and Jackson so differently?" I remember feeling defensive at first. "They're just busy," I said. "And Jackson has football, so they have to go to all his games." Zoe gave me a look that I now recognize as pity. "My mom has 4 kids and works 2 jobs, but she's never forgotten to pick any of us up. Not once." That conversation planted a seed in my mind that would grow over the years. Maybe it wasn't normal. Maybe it wasn't my fault. I found refuge in my academics. If my parents wouldn't notice me, perhaps my teachers would. I threw myself into every assignment, every project, every extracurricular activity that might showcase my intelligence. And it worked. My teachers praised my dedication and abilities. They used words like gifted and exceptional, words I never heard at home. My journal became my confidant. Every night I would write down the day's slights and disappointments, as well as my small victories that went uncelebrated at home. Today, I got 100 on my science project. Mrs. Wilson said it was the best in class. Mom asked why I needed so many supplies. Dad didn't say anything. By the time I turned 13, I had constructed an elaborate fantasy in my mind. Perhaps I was adopted. Perhaps my real parents were out there somewhere missing me, wondering what had happened to their daughter. It was easier to believe that than to accept the reality that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally simply didn't. Jackson wasn't cruel to me, not exactly. He was just accustomed to being the center of attention and seemed uncomfortable when I occasionally tried to assert myself. There were moments when I caught him looking at me with what seemed like guilt, but they were fleeting. He was 4 years older than me, and by the time I was truly aware of the family dynamic, he was already deep into his high school years, preoccupied with sports and popularity and planning for college. My mother Diana had these little sayings that cut deep. "Beauty isn't your strong suit, but at least you're smart," she would say while brushing my hair before school. Or, "No wonder your clothes still fit from last year, you haven't grown at all," when back to school shopping. Each comment delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. My father Brian was more distant than cruel. He seemed perpetually surprised to find me in rooms of our house as if he'd momentarily forgotten I existed. "Oh, Ava, I didn't see you there," was practically his catchphrase. He worked as a sales executive at a pharmaceutical company, a job that required charm and charisma qualities he displayed abundantly outside our home, but rarely within it, at least not toward me. Despite everything, I continued to seek their approval. I would make breakfast on weekends, hoping they would notice and appreciate the gesture. I would ask thoughtful questions about their days, trying to engage them in conversation. I would offer to help with chores without being asked. Nothing seemed to break through the invisible barrier. By the time I turned 14, I had developed strategies for emotional survival. I learned to find validation in places other than my family. I created a schedule that minimized my time at home while still maintaining my excellent grades. I built a small but loyal circle of friends who seemed to value me in ways my family did not. And through it all, I continued to hope that someday something would change. When I turned 15, something in me shifted. The quiet, accommodating girl who had tried so desperately to earn her parents' love began to question why she should have to try at all. It started with small challenges to the status quo. At dinner one night, when my mother praised Jackson for getting a C on a difficult math test, I asked, "Why is his C being celebrated when my A's are just expected?" The table went silent. My father's fork stopped midway to his mouth. My mother's smile froze in place. Jackson looked down at his plate. "Don't be petty, Ava," my mother finally said. "Not everything is about you." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me, but I didn't have the words then to articulate how nothing in our family had ever been about me. As that year progressed, my mother's passive aggression intensified. When I needed her signature for a field trip to a prestigious university where I had been specially selected to attend a young writer's workshop, she forgot until the morning it was due, forcing me to run to school early to submit it. When I asked why we had no pictures of my middle school graduation on the walls, she claimed they didn't turn out well, even though I had seen them, and they were fine. My father's dismissiveness became more overt. When I asked for help with college research, he told me, "Just apply to the state school. That's all we need for you." When Jackson had been applying to colleges the year before, my father had taken 2 weeks off work to tour campuses with him. The worst part was that Jackson, now 19 and home from his first year of college, sometimes joined in. "Drama queen," he would mutter when I stood up for myself. "Always making everything so complicated," he would say to my parents, who would nod in agreement. My mental health began to deteriorate. I struggled to sleep, lying awake, analyzing and reanalyzing every interaction, wondering what I could do differently to be worthy of love in my own home. I lost weight as my anxiety made eating difficult. I developed a habit of pulling at my hair when stressed, leaving small bald patches that I carefully covered. Throughout this difficult period, my friendship with Zoe remained my lifeline. Her house became my sanctuary, a place where I could exist without constantly monitoring my words and actions. Her parents always greeted me warmly, included me in family meals, and asked genuine questions about my interests and aspirations. "You know you can always stay here if things get too rough at home." Zoe's mom told me one evening, her eyes full of concern. I thanked her, but assured her things were fine. Even then, I was protecting my family's image, still somehow convinced that the problem must be me. At school, I found another unexpected ally in my English teacher, Ms. Lambert. She noticed how I would linger in her classroom after the final bell, reluctant to head home. She began giving me books that weren't on the curriculum, works that featured resilient young protagonists facing adversity. We would discuss them during lunch periods, and through these conversations, she subtly let me know that she saw me, truly saw me in a way my family never had. "You have a voice, Ava," she told me once. "A powerful one. Don't ever let anyone convince you to silence it." In the spring of my sophomore year, a life-changing opportunity appeared. A prestigious summer writing program at Northwestern University had accepted me based on a portfolio I had submitted in secret. I would need my parents' permission and a modest fee to attend. For weeks, I rehearsed how I would present this to them, gathering all the information about the program's credentials, the college credits I would earn, the doors it could open. I chose a Sunday evening when everyone seemed in good spirits. Jackson was home for the weekend, having completed his freshman year of college. My father had closed a big sale at work. My mother had received compliments on her garden from the neighbors. The timing seemed perfect. "I have some exciting news," I said, my voice already trembling despite my best efforts. I explained about the program, emphasizing what an honor it was to be selected. As I spoke, I watched their expressions shift from polite attention to something closer to annoyance. "Northwestern, Saul," my father said when I finished. "That's in Chicago. Who's going to pay for that?" "The program itself is covered by a scholarship," I explained, my hope fading. "We just need to cover transportation and a few incidentals." My mother exchanged a glance with my father. "We already have vacation plans in July. We can't change everything for this." "I could go on my own," I suggested. "I'm almost 16. My father laughed dismissively. "Don't be ridiculous." And that was that. No discussion of alternatives, no recognition of the achievement, no suggestion that we might revisit the topic. Just a firm no, as if I had asked for something extravagant and unnecessary, rather than an educational opportunity that might shape my future. That evening, I overheard my parents discussing finances in their bedroom. Curious and still smarting from the rejection, I paused outside their door. "Jackson's tuition increase is going to stretch us thin next semester," my father was saying. "Well, the college fund should cover it," my mother replied. "We might need to use some of our savings to supplement." Their words hit me like physical blows. College fund. They had a college fund for Jackson. In that moment, I realized with sickening clarity that they had never started one for me. Later that week, I worked up the courage to ask directly about my own college fund. The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed what I already knew. "We'll figure something out when the time comes," my father finally said. "Scholarships, loans. You're smart, you'll find a way." They had never intended to support my education the way they supported Jackson's. The realization was devastating, but clarifying. This wasn't about me not being good enough. This was about them never seeing me as worth the same investment as my brother. As my 16th birthday approached, I found myself increasingly withdrawn at home. I stopped making efforts to engage my family in conversation. I stopped sharing my accomplishments. I stopped expecting acknowledgement or celebration. Survival mode had fully kicked in, and I was just counting down the days until I could legally leave. Lambert noticed the change in me. After class one day, she asked me to stay behind. "Ava, I'm concerned about you," she said. "You're still doing excellent work, but there's something different. You seem dimmed somehow." I nearly broke down then, but years of containing my emotions had made me skilled at maintaining composure. "I'm just focused on the future," I told her. She studied me for a moment. "My door is always open," she said finally. "For any reason, remember that." I didn't know then how important those words would become. I didn't know that within a matter of weeks her open door would be my salvation. The dinner party happened 3 days after my 16th birthday, a milestone that had passed with minimal fanfare in our house. My father had important colleagues coming over, people from the pharmaceutical company where he worked as a sales executive. My mother had been preparing for days, planning an elaborate meal and obsessively cleaning every corner of our already immaculate home. "Ava, you'll need to help serve and clear the plates," my mother informed me the morning of the dinner. "And wear something presentable, please, not those baggy things you usually wear." I nodded, already resigned to my role as household staff rather than family member. Jackson, home from college for the summer, wasn't assigned any duties for the evening. He would be present as the beloved son, the successful college athlete, the pride of the family. As I helped my mother prepare the appetizers that afternoon, I found myself hoping that maybe tonight would be different. Maybe in front of his colleagues, my father would acknowledge me positively. Maybe there would be questions about my accomplishments, my interests, my plans. Maybe I would finally be visible. By 6 o'clock, the house was transformed. Candles flickered on the dining table. Classical music played softly from hidden speakers. The aroma of roasted chicken and herbs filled the air. I had followed my mother's instructions, wearing a modest blue dress and pulling my hair back neatly. When I came downstairs, she gave me a cursory glance and nodded, which was as close to approval as I could expect. The guests began arriving at 6:30. 4 couples, all dressed in business casual attire, all bearing wine or desserts as offerings. I stood in the background as my father greeted them effusively, my mother complimented their outfits, and Jackson charmed them with his easy confidence. No one introduced me. I was as invisible as the furniture. When everyone had arrived and was settled in the living room with drinks, I began circulating with the tray of appetizers as instructed. One woman, noticing me for the first time, smiled and said, "And who is this lovely young lady?" Before I could answer, my mother stepped in. "This is Ava, our daughter. She's helping serve tonight. Ava, this is Dr. Patel, the head of research at your father's company." Dr. Patel extended her hand to me. "Wonderful to meet you, Ava. Are you still in high school?" I nodded. "I'm a sophomore." "Well, I'll be a junior next fall." "She does well enough in school," my mother interjected, already steering the conversation away from me. "But Jackson here is the real academic star. He made Dean's List his first year at University of Michigan." And just like that, I was dismissed. Dr. Patel's attention shifted to Jackson, who launched into a story about his freshman year experiences. I continued around the room with my tray, a ghost in my own home. Dinner itself was a performance of family harmony. My father at the head of the table, my mother at the foot, Jackson and I on opposite sides with the guests filling in the remaining seats. I sat between two men whose names I had already forgotten, feeling increasingly invisible as the wine flowed and the conversation grew louder. The first hour of dinner passed in a blur of forced smiles and polite nods, whenever anyone happened to glance my way. I dutifully cleared plates between courses, refilled water glasses, and tried to make myself as unobtrusive as possible. No one seemed to notice when I was absent from the table, and no one engaged me in conversation when I was present. As dessert was served and the second bottles of wine were opened, the atmosphere shifted. The professional veneer began to slip, and the conversation turned more personal. My father, normally so controlled, was flushed with alcohol and success, clearly enjoying being the center of attention in his domain. "Tell them about Jackson's scholarship offers, Diana," he prompted my mother, who launched into a detailed recounting of Jackson's athletic prowess and the multiple universities that had recruited him. "We always knew he was special," she concluded, reaching over to squeeze Jackson's hand affectionately. "From the moment he was born." "Both your kids seem great," said one of the men, the one sitting directly across from me. I think his name was Thomas. "Do you have college plans for Ava too?" There was a slight pause, a moment of uncomfortable silence that should have warned me what was coming. But even after years of subtle and not-so-subtle slights, I wasn't prepared for what happened next. My father laughed, a sound with no warmth in it. "College plans for Ava," he repeated as if the question was inherently amusing. "Well, Thomas, that would require planning, wouldn't it? And Ava here wasn't exactly planned." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter circled the table. I felt my face grow hot. "Brian," my mother said in what might have sounded like a warning to someone who didn't know her. But there was a smile playing at her lips. "What?" my father said, emboldened by the laughter and the wine. "It's no secret. Ava was the family mistake. We had it all mapped out with Jackson. One perfect kid college fund started life on track. Then surprise." My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I stared down at my untouched dessert, willing myself to disappear completely. "Kids are always a blessing, planned or not," Dr. Patel said clearly, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But my mother, who should have defended me, who should have shut this down immediately, instead raised her glass as if in toast. Birth control's only 99% effective, she said, pointing directly at me with her free hand. He's the 1%. The table erupted in laughter, all except for Dr. Patel, who looked deeply uncomfortable, and Jackson, who was studying his wine glass with sudden intensity. I felt something break inside me. It wasn't just the humiliation of the moment, although that was excruciating. It was the confirmation of what I had suspected for years. I wasn't just unloved, I was unwanted. I was a mistake, an accident, a burden they had been forced to bear. I don't remember excusing myself from the table. I don't remember walking upstairs to my bedroom. The next clear memory I have is of sitting on the edge of my bed, my entire body trembling, tears streaming down my face but making no sound. Years of practice had made me an expert at silent crying. Through the floor, I could hear the dinner party continuing. More laughter, the clink of glasses, the sound of my family's life going on perfectly well without me in it. I looked around my bedroom at the sparse decorations and minimal personal touches. Even this space didn't feel like mine. It was just a room in their house, a place they had allocated to me out of obligation. Nothing here represented safety or comfort or belonging. In that moment, with perfect clarity, I knew I couldn't spend another night in this house. The decision, once made, brought with it a strange calm. I was 16 years old. I was smart. I was resourceful. And most importantly, I deserved better than this. I moved quietly, methodically. From under my bed, I pulled out the backpack I used for school. Into it went a few changes of clothes, my journal, the copy of Jane Eyre, that Ms. Lambert had given me, my phone charger, and the birthday card from Zoe that contained the only acknowledgement I'd received on turning 16. From my hiding place inside a hollowed-out old dictionary, I took the $40 I had saved from occasional babysitting jobs. Money my parents didn't know I had. I changed out of the blue dress into jeans and a sweater. Practical clothes for whatever came next. I left my phone on the bed after sending a quick text to Zoe. Need a place tonight, emergency, will explain later. On a sheet of notebook paper, I wrote a brief note. I heard you tonight. Now you don't have to pretend anymore. Your mistake is removing herself from your life. Don't look for me. Ava. I left the note on my pillow, took one last look at the room, and quietly walked out. Down the back stairs, through the kitchen where the dirty dishes were piled high, and out the side door that was rarely used and made almost no sound when opened. No one saw me leave. No one called my name. No one noticed the family mistake was gone until the next morning. By then, I was already miles away, both physically and emotionally. The night air hit my face as I closed the door behind me. It was mid-May, warm enough that I didn't need a heavy jacket, but cool enough that I shivered slightly in my thin sweater. Or maybe that was just shock setting in. I walked quickly down our street, fighting the urge to look back at the house. Part of me still couldn't believe what I was doing. Part of me was terrified. But a stronger part, a part I didn't even know existed until that moment, was resolute. I deserved better. I would find better. Zoe's house was about 2 miles away. Under normal circumstances, I would never have walked there alone at night. But these weren't normal circumstances. I stuck to well-lit streets and walked purposefully, my backpack slung over both shoulders, my hands gripping the straps tightly. When I arrived, Zoe was waiting for me on the front porch. One look at my face told her everything she needed to know. Without a word, she wrapped me in a hug, and for the first time since leaving my house, I allowed myself to cry audibly. "My parents are still up," she whispered as she guided me inside. "I told them something happened at your house and you needed a place to stay." Zoe's parents, unlike mine, were warm and concerned. They didn't press for details when they saw my tear-stained face, but they made it clear I was welcome in their home. "You can stay as long as you need, Ava," Zoe's mother said, squeezing my shoulder gently. "We've always got room for you." That first night, I slept in Zoe's room on a trundle bed they kept for guests. Sleep came in fits and starts, my mind racing with questions about what would happen next. Would my parents come looking for me? Would they force me to return home? Would they even care that I was gone? Morning came, and with it the first text from my mother. "Where are you?" "Come home immediately." No concern, no apology, just a command. I didn't respond. An hour later, my father texted, "This behavior is unacceptable. You're embarrassing the family. Come home now." Again, no concern for my well-being, just worry about how my absence reflected on them. I turned off my phone. Zoe's parents were incredible, but I knew I couldn't stay with them long-term. For one thing, they would eventually be legally obligated to inform my parents of my whereabouts. For another, I didn't want to put them in a difficult position or take advantage of their kindness. On the second day of my self-imposed exile, I reached out to Ms. Lambert. Through Zoe's phone, I sent her a carefully worded email explaining that I had left home due to an unsafe emotional environment and needed guidance on my options. Ms. Lambert responded immediately, asking to meet me at a coffee shop near the school. When I arrived, she was already there, her face etched with worry. "Ava," she said, "I need to be honest with you. As a teacher, I have certain legal obligations if I believe a minor is in danger or has run away from home." My heart sank. "So, you have to tell my parents where I am?" "Not necessarily," she said, "but I do need to ensure you're safe. Tell me exactly what happened." I told her everything about the dinner party, about the years of emotional neglect, about the clear favoritism shown to Jackson. As I spoke, I watched her expression shift from concern to anger. "That's emotional abuse," she said when I finished. "It might not leave physical marks, but the damage is real." She took a deep breath and reached for her bag. "I have a friend who works at the Youth Services Center. She might be able to help us figure out your options. Would you be willing to speak with her?" I nodded, grateful beyond words for this adult who was taking me seriously, who wasn't dismissing my experience or insisting I return to a home that had never really been one. The youth services worker, a woman named Teresa, met with us later that day. She explained my limited options as a 16-year-old. I could file for emancipation, but that was a lengthy legal process with no guarantee of success. I could enter the foster care system, but at my age, placement could be challenging. Or I could try to work something out informally with my parents. "The reality is," Teresa explained gently, "most runaways either return home eventually or end up in precarious situations. I don't want either of those outcomes for you." She suggested a temporary solution, a youth shelter where I could stay for up to 30 days while we sorted out more permanent arrangements. The shelter had social workers on staff who could potentially mediate between me and my parents if I was willing. "I'm not going back to that house," I said firmly. "Not after what they said. Not after years of making me feel like I shouldn't exist." Teresa nodded, respecting my decision. "Then we'll focus on alternatives. But Ava, you need to understand that this won't be easy. You're still a minor, and that limits your options." That afternoon, Ms. Lambert drove me to the youth shelter. It was a nondescript building in a part of town I rarely visited, with security cameras at the entrance, and a sign that simply read, "Youth Services." Inside, it was clean, but institutional. The staff were kind but busy, clearly dealing with kids in situations far more dire than mine. I was assigned a small room that I would share with another girl, given a set of toiletries and some basic information about the shelter's rules and resources. Ms. Lambert hugged me before she left, promising to check in regularly and to bring me any schoolwork I might miss. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met, Ava," she said, "but you don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to ask for help." My roommate at the shelter was a 17-year-old named Lily, who had left home after her mother's new boyfriend made her feel unsafe. We recognized in each other the same determination to create better lives for ourselves, and a friendship quickly formed. "The trick is to use every resource they offer here," Lily advised me on my first night. "Job counseling, education, support therapy, whatever they've got. You've got 30 days here. Make them count." I took her advice to heart. During the day, I would attend school, maintaining my perfect attendance record despite the chaos of my personal life. After school, I would go to the public library to do homework and research my options. In the evenings, I would return to the shelter for dinner and whatever workshops or counseling sessions were available. My parents did try to find me in their way. They called the school, they called Zoe's parents, they even filed a missing persons report with the police. But when the police located me at the shelter and confirmed I was safe, they seemed satisfied that no crime had been committed. A social worker did speak with my parents, and after that conversation, the intensity of their search diminished noticeably. They said they want you to come home, but they weren't willing to commit to family therapy or make any concrete changes, the social worker told me. The ball is in their court now. 2 weeks into my stay at the shelter, I got my first job at a diner about a mile away. The hours were long, and the pay was minimum wage, but it was a start. Every dollar I earned went into a small savings account the shelter had helped me open. My goal was simple: survive until I turned 18, then build a real life for myself. With the help of the shelter's education counselor, I began researching my options for completing high school. Traditional school would be difficult if I didn't return home, but there were GED programs that might work with my situation. "You're smart enough to pass the GED tomorrow," the counselor told me after reviewing my academic records. "But I think we can do better than that. Let's look at alternative high school programs that might allow you to graduate with a full diploma." The days at the shelter turned into weeks. My 30-day limit was approaching, and I still didn't have a solid long-term plan. Lily had already moved on, having reconciled with her mother after the boyfriend was removed from the picture. I missed her steady presence and practical advice. As the deadline loomed, I received an unexpected lifeline. Ms. Lambert called me into a meeting with the shelter's director and a woman I didn't recognize. "Ava, this is my sister Karen," Ms. Lambert said. "She lives about an hour from here and has a spare room in her apartment." Karen smiled warmly at me. "Rachel has told me all about you," she said, referring to Ms. Lambert by her first name. "I understand you need a place to stay while you figure out your next steps." It turned out that Karen, a single woman in her 30s who worked as a graphic designer, was willing to let me stay in her spare room in exchange for help around the apartment and with some of her freelance work. The arrangement wouldn't be permanent, but it would buy me time to save money and plan my future. The shelter staff helped facilitate the arrangement, making sure all the necessary paperwork was in order to make it legal and above board. It wasn't adoption or foster care in the traditional sense, but a kind of informal guardianship that would allow me to finish high school in a stable environment. The day I left the shelter for Karen's apartment marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I had $40, a backpack full of possessions, and a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I could build something better than what I had left behind. Living with Karen was nothing like living with my parents. Her apartment was small but bright, filled with art and books and plants. She worked from home most days, designing websites and marketing materials for local businesses. Her schedule was flexible, and she seemed genuinely happy to have company in the evenings. "I'm not trying to be your mother," she told me on my first night there. "I'm more like an older roommate who has your back. We'll figure out the rules and boundaries as we go." The relief of being in a space where I wasn't constantly walking on eggshells was overwhelming. I could leave a glass in the sink without fear of criticism. I could laugh out loud without being told I was too noisy. I could exist fully and freely without apology. Karen helped me get enrolled in an alternative high school program that allowed flexible scheduling to accommodate my work hours. I continued my job at the diner, picking up extra shifts whenever possible to build my savings. On weekends, I helped Karen with her freelance work, learning basic graphic design skills that would later prove invaluable. My phone remained off for the first month after leaving home. When I finally turned it back on, I had dozens of messages from my parents ranging from angry demands to return home to seemingly concerned questions about my welfare. None contained an apology. None acknowledged the hurt they had caused. None suggested they understood why I had left. I didn't respond to any of them. Instead, I sent a brief message to Jackson, letting him know I was safe and asking him not to share my number with our parents. His reply was short: "I'm sorry for what happened. I should have said something that night." Too little, too late. But at least it was something. As summer turned to fall, I settled into a routine. School during the day, work in the evenings, quiet weekends with Karen, or occasional outings with new friends from the alternative school. I was exhausted most of the time, but it was a different kind of tired than what I had experienced at home. This exhaustion came from working towards something, not from the constant tension of trying to make myself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. The holidays were difficult. Karen invited me to join her at her parents' house for Thanksgiving, but I declined, picking up a double shift at the diner instead. Christmas was harder to avoid, and I found myself seated around a table with Karen's extended family, all of whom had clearly been briefed on my situation and went out of their way to make me feel welcome. Karen's mother pressed a small gift into my hands after dinner. "Rachel told us you like to write," she said. "Every writer needs a good pen." Inside the box was a beautiful fountain pen with my initials engraved on it. It was the most thoughtful gift I had received in years from people who barely knew me, but somehow saw me more clearly than my own family ever had. I maintained minimal contact with Zoe, who kept me updated on happenings at my old school and occasionally news about my family. According to her, my parents had told everyone I was going through a phase and had chosen to attend a different school. They hadn't mentioned that I was no longer living at home. "They redecorated your room," Zoe told me during one of our rare phone calls. "It's a home office now." The news stung, but not as much as I expected. It was just confirmation of what I had always known. I had been an inconvenience, a footnote in their lives. My absence was more convenient than my presence had ever been. As winter gave way to spring, I received unexpected news that would change the trajectory of my life. Ms. Lambert had submitted one of my essays to a writing contest without telling me, and I had won a small scholarship to a community college in a city about 100 miles away. "It's not a full ride," she told me when she delivered the news. "But it's a start, and that city has more opportunities than this one. You could build a real life there." The prospect was both terrifying and exhilarating. A new city, a fresh start, a place where no one knew me as the girl who wasn't wanted by her own family. By the time I turned 17, I had earned my high school diploma through the alternative program, saved nearly $2,000, and made plans to move to the new city for college that fall. Karen helped me find a tiny studio apartment I could afford with my savings and a part-time job. Ms. Lambert drove me to tour the campus and meet with admissions counselors. Everything was falling into place piece by precarious piece. The life I was building was fragile, but undeniably mine. Every decision, every small victory belonged to me in a way nothing ever had when I lived with my parents. The day I left for the new city was bittersweet. Karen had become more than just a landlord or guardian. She had become a friend, a mentor, a glimpse of what supportive family could look like. Saying goodbye to her and to Ms. Lambert was difficult. "This isn't goodbye," Ms. Lambert insisted, hugging me tightly before I boarded the bus. "This is just the beginning of your story, Ava. Make it a good one." With those words echoing in my mind, I arrived in my new city, a place of possibilities and unknowns. The studio apartment was smaller than I had expected, and in a neighborhood that made me double-check my locks at night, but it was mine. I had signed the lease myself. I had paid the security deposit with money I had earned. I was building a life from scratch, one scary, exhilarating step at a time. College was a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who knew nothing about my past, who had no preconceived notions about me. I could be whoever I wanted to be, and what I wanted most was to be authentic, to stop hiding the parts of myself I had been taught were too much, too loud, too present. I threw myself into my classes, particularly English and journalism. Writing had always been my escape, my way of making sense of the world. Now it was becoming my identity, my potential career path. My professors praised my work, encouraged my ambitions, pushed me to submit to student publications and contests. Working while attending college full-time was exhausting. I found a job as a barista at a coffee shop near campus, working opening shifts that required me to be there by 5:30 in the morning. After my classes, I would pick up tutoring gigs or odd jobs to make ends meet. Some nights I was so tired that I fell asleep still wearing my clothes books scattered around me on my small bed. But the exhaustion was worth it for the freedom. No one was tracking my movements, questioning my decisions, or making me feel like my existence was an inconvenience. The tiny studio apartment became my sanctuary, a place where I could truly relax for perhaps the first time in my life. During my second semester, I met Jasmine, a photography student, who became my closest friend and eventually my roommate. Sharing an apartment meant lower rent for both of us, allowing me to work slightly fewer hours and focus more on my studies. Jasmine's easygoing nature and genuine interest in people was a balm for my still healing heart. You never talk about your family, she observed one evening as we shared takeout Chinese food on our secondhand couch. Are they not in the picture? It was a simple question asked without judgment, but it still made my chest tighten. It's complicated, I said. We're not in contact. Jasmine nodded, accepting this without pressing for details. Family isn't always who you're related to, she said. Sometimes it's who you choose. Her words stayed with me, a permission slip to build connections that weren't defined by blood or obligation, but by genuine care and mutual respect. Over time, Jasmine and our small circle of friends became what I started to think of as my chosen family people, who saw me, valued me, and chose to have me in their lives. During my second year of college, I finally sought therapy. The community health center near campus offered services on a sliding scale, making it just barely affordable with my tight budget. My therapist, Dr. Morgan, helped me understand that what I had experienced in my family was not normal or acceptable. What you're describing is emotional neglect and abuse, she told me during one of our early sessions. The fact that you've built this new life for yourself shows remarkable resilience, but it's okay to acknowledge the harm that was done to you. Those sessions were painful, but healing. I cried more in Dr. Morgan's office than I had allowed myself to cry in years. I unpacked the layers of shame and unworthiness that had been instilled in me. I learned to recognize the ways my upbringing had shaped my relationships and self-perception. And slowly, I began to rewrite the internal narrative that had been dictating my life. By the time I was 20, I had made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. I legally changed my last name. No longer would I carry the name of people who had made it clear I was unwanted. Instead, I chose Lambert, a tribute to the teacher who had seen potential in me when my own family could not. Ms. Lambert, my Rachel as I now called her, cried when I told her. I'm honored, she said. But are you sure this is what you want? I was sure. The day the official paperwork came through, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Ava Lambert, a name I had chosen, a name that represented not where I came from but where I was going. College graduation came faster than I expected. I had maintained a near-perfect GPA while working part-time and had secured a job at a small marketing agency set to start a month after graduation. The position wasn't glamorous, and the pay was modest, but it was a foot in the door of a competitive industry. The day I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I scanned the audience out of habit, looking for faces that I knew wouldn't be there. Instead, I found Jasmine, Karen, and Rachel cheering loudly as my name was called. My chosen family celebrating a milestone my biological family had never believed I would achieve. That summer, I moved into my first real apartment, a one-bedroom in a safer neighborhood with actual separate rooms and a kitchen big enough to cook proper meals. I adopted a cat from the local shelter, a black and white tuxedo cat I named Pepper, who became my constant companion. I bought furniture that wasn't secondhand, decorated walls with art that spoke to me, created a space that felt truly mine. At the marketing agency, I quickly proved myself valuable. My writing skills and graphic design knowledge, thanks to those weekends helping Karen, set me apart from other entry-level employees. Within a year, I was given my own small accounts to manage. By the time I was 21, I had received my first promotion. Life was good. Not perfect, but good. I had a job I enjoyed, friends who valued me, a comfortable home, enough money to occasionally treat myself to dinner out or a new book. The nightmares about that dinner party had become less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. The trust issues remained a work in progress, but therapy was helping. I maintained minimal contact with Zoe, who had gone to college on the East Coast but still returned to our hometown for holidays. Through her, I learned that my brother Jackson had graduated and taken a job in Chicago, that my father had had some health problems, but was recovering, that my mother still mentioned me occasionally, but never acknowledged that I had left home at 16. They remodeled the house, Zoe told me during one of our sporadic phone calls. Your old room is a guest bedroom now? The information didn't hurt the way it once might have. My old room had never really been mine anyway. Now I had a whole apartment that was undeniably, unquestionably mine, filled with things I had chosen and earned. As I approached my 22nd birthday, I realized that it had been nearly 6 years since I had seen or spoken directly to my parents. 6 years of building a life they knew nothing about. 6 years of healing from wounds they had never acknowledged inflicting. 6 years of becoming someone they wouldn't recognize if they passed me on the street. I didn't know then that the carefully constructed wall between my past and present was about to come crashing down. I didn't know that the family I had walked away from was about to re-enter my life in a way I could never have anticipated. I didn't know that the strength I had built over those 6 years was about to be tested in ways that would either break me completely or finally set me free. The first contact came on an ordinary Tuesday in March. I was at work deep in concentration on a project for a new client when my phone buzzed with a notification from a social media platform I rarely used. Someone had sent me a direct message. When I opened the app during my lunch break, I felt my entire body go cold. The message was from Jackson. Ava, I know it's been a long time. I'm not sure if this is still your account, but if it is, please read this. Mom and Dad have been looking for you. Dad had a heart attack last month. He's stable now, but it was serious. They want to find you. I know what they did was wrong. I was wrong too. But people can change. Please consider reaching out. I miss my sister. I stared at the message until my screen went dark. Then I locked myself in the office bathroom and had my first panic attack in years. My heart raced, my vision blurred at the edges, and I couldn't catch my breath. When I finally managed to calm down enough to return to my desk, I closed the app without responding and tried to focus on work. That evening, I called Dr. Morgan, who had become more of a mentor than a therapist over the years. She agreed to see me for an emergency session the following day. You don't owe them a response, she reminded me as I sat in her office, still shaken by the unexpected contact. You don't owe them forgiveness. You don't owe them anything. But what if they've really changed? I asked, hating the hope that still lived somewhere deep inside me. What if they're different now? Dr. Morgan's expression was gentle but serious. People can change, Ava, but change requires acknowledgement, atonement, and consistent effort over time. A crisis like a heart attack might prompt reflection, but it doesn't automatically transform someone. Whatever you decide to do, protect yourself first. I nodded, grateful for her wisdom. I'm not the same person who left that night. I said more to myself than to her. I'm stronger now. I know who I am. Yes, she agreed. You do. Trust that knowledge. For 2 weeks, I let Jackson's message sit unanswered. I discussed it in therapy. I talked it over with Jasmine and Karen. I wrote pages in my journal working through the complicated emotions it stirred up. Finally, I decided that ignoring it completely would give my family too much power over me. I would respond on my terms, setting clear boundaries from the start. My reply was brief and direct. Jackson, I'm sorry to hear about Dad's health problems. I hope he's recovering well. I've built a life for myself that I'm proud of. I'm not ready for direct contact with Mom and Dad, but I'm willing to talk with you. Here's my number. Please don't share it without my permission. Jackson called the same day. Hearing his voice after 6 years was surreal. He sounded older, more mature, but still recognizably my brother. The conversation was awkward at first, both of us dancing around the elephant in the room. Eventually, I asked him directly about that night, about why he had never stood up for me. I was a coward, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I knew how they treated you was wrong. I benefited from it, and I was too selfish and too scared to rock the boat. I've carried that guilt for years, Ava. When you disappeared that night, I knew immediately why. And I did nothing. I let them convince me you were just being dramatic, that you'd come back. By the time we realized you were really gone, the trail was cold. They didn't look very hard, I said, the old hurt rising despite my best efforts to contain it. No, he agreed, surprising me with his honesty. They didn't, not at first. Dad was angry, Mom was embarrassed. They told everyone you were staying with a friend studying abroad, all kinds of stories. It was only when months passed and you didn't come back that they seemed to realize what they'd done. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Jackson told me about my father's heart attack, about how it had changed him, made him more reflective. He told me about my mother's growing depression as the years passed with no word from me. He told me how they had hired a private investigator 3 years ago, but had come up empty. How did you find me now? I asked, curious despite myself. Social media, he admitted. The PI couldn't find you because you changed your name, but I remembered your English teacher, the one you always talked about. I found her online and she had a post congratulating her former student Ava Lambert on a writing award. I took a chance that it was you. Clever. And concerning. If Jackson could find me that easily, my parents could too. They want to see you? Jackson said, confirming my fears. They talk about you all the time now, about how they messed up, about what they would say if they could see you again. I don't know if I'm ready for that, I said honestly. I've worked hard to heal from what happened in that house. Seeing them could undo a lot of that work. I understand, Jackson said, and I believed he did. But will you at least think about it? They're not the same people they were 6 years ago. Neither am I. And I'm guessing neither are you. After that first call, Jackson and I spoke weekly. Our conversations were tentative at first, but gradually became more comfortable as we reestablished a connection. He respected my boundaries, never pushing me to contact our parents directly, though he did occasionally update me on their lives. 3 months into our renewed communication, Jackson asked if he could visit me. No pressure, he assured me. I won't tell them where you live. I just want to see my sister face to face to properly apologize for everything. After considerable thought and discussion with my support system, I agreed. Jackson came for a weekend in June. Seeing him standing in the doorway of my apartment was surreal. A piece of my past suddenly materialized in my carefully constructed present. The visit went better than I had expected. Jackson was genuinely interested in my life, impressed by my career, and respectful of the boundaries I had established. When he left, he hugged me for the first time in 6 years. I'm proud of you, Ava, he said. You've built an amazing life without any help from us. I'm so sorry for the part I played in hurting you. His visit had gone well, but it had also stirred up memories and emotions I had worked hard to process and contain. In the weeks that followed, I found myself thinking more about my parents than I had in years, wondering if they really had changed, if there could ever be any kind of healthy relationship between us. I wasn't ready to see them, but I did something I had avoided for years. I looked them up online. My father's company website showed a man who had aged considerably since I last saw him, his once dark hair now mostly gray. My mother's community garden club had photos of events, and in them I could see that she had lost weight, her face more lined than I remembered. They looked like strangers to me, people I might pass on the street without a second glance. And yet, they were the people whose actions and words had shaped so much of who I had become, both the broken parts I had to heal and the strong parts I had built out of necessity. 6 months after Jackson's first message, he called with news that sent a jolt of panic through me. Mom and Dad found your address, he said, his voice tight with concern. I didn't give it to them, I swear. But Dad hired another PI, and this time they found you through your job. They're talking about driving up to see you this weekend. Without asking, I said, anger flaring. Without my permission, that's exactly the kind of boundary violation that made me leave in the first place. I know, Jackson said. I tried to talk them out of it. I told them they should wait until you're ready. But they're desperate, Ava. Dad's health scare made them realize they might not have unlimited time to make things right. Making things right would start with respecting my wishes, I snapped. You're absolutely right, he agreed. And I've told them that. But they're coming anyway. I thought you should know so you can prepare or not be home or whatever you need to do. After we hung up, I paced, my apartment anxiety coursing through me. The idea of my parents showing up uninvited at my door, invading the safe space I had created, made me physically ill. But the thought of continuing to run, of moving apartments or changing jobs to avoid them, made me angry. I had done nothing wrong. I should not have to disrupt my life because they had suddenly decided they wanted forgiveness. I called Dr. Morgan, who offered to come sit with me during their visit if I decided to see them. I called Karen and Rachel, who both offered their homes as refuge if I needed to escape. I called Jasmine, who immediately volunteered to be there as emotional support. The night before they were supposedly coming, I barely slept. I ran through every possible scenario in my mind, from slamming the door in their faces to breaking down in tears to discovering they had completely transformed into loving, respectful people. Morning came, and with it a strange calm. I had survived the worst they could do. I had built a life they had never thought possible for me. I had become someone strong and whole despite their efforts to make me feel like the family mistake. Whatever happened today, I would still be Ava Lambert tomorrow. I asked Jasmine to come over around noon, the time Jackson thought they might arrive. We made coffee, tried to distract ourselves with a movie, and waited. At 12:30, the doorbell rang. My heart nearly stopped. Through the peephole, I could see them. My parents. Older, smaller somehow than in my memories. My father leaning slightly on a cane. My mother clutching her purse with white knuckles. Both looking nervous in a way I had never seen before. I took a deep breath, feeling Jasmine's reassuring presence behind me, and opened the door to the people I had spent 6 years trying to forget. The moment the door swung open, everything seemed to stop. There they stood, my parents, looking simultaneously familiar and like complete strangers. My father's face, once so intimidating to me, now appeared haggard, the aftermath of his heart attack evident in his pallor and the way he leaned on his cane. My mother, always so perfectly put together in my memories, looked smaller, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the deep worry lines around her eyes. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I could see the shock in their eyes as they took in the woman I had become, so different from the frightened 16-year-old who had slipped away in the night. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. My father seemed to age another decade before my eyes, his shoulders slumping as if under an invisible weight. My first instinct was to close the door to protect the sanctuary I had created for myself. Instead, I found my voice cool and steady. "This is unexpected," I said, neither welcoming nor dismissing them. "You should have called first." "Ava." My mother whispered my name on her lips, sounding both familiar and foreign. "Oh my God, Ava." My father cleared his throat, his hand tightening on his cane. "We weren't sure you would take our call," he said, his voice rougher than I remembered. "We had to see you." Behind me, I felt Jasmine step closer, her presence giving me strength. "I have company," I said, gesturing slightly toward her. "This isn't a good time for a surprise visit." "Please," my mother said, and the desperation in her voice was something I had never heard from her before. "Just 5 minutes. We've been looking for you for so long." I considered them for a moment, these people who had once held so much power over me. Now, standing in the doorway of my own apartment, paid for with my own money, I realized that the power dynamic had shifted. I was no longer the powerless child desperate for their approval. I was a woman who had built a life without them, who didn't need anything they had to offer. 20 minutes, I said, finally stepping back to allow them entry. "Then I have plans for the afternoon." They stepped into my apartment, their movements hesitant as if entering sacred ground. I watched as they took in the space I had created, my books lining the shelves, my writing awards framed on the wall. Pepper the cat regarding them suspiciously from his perch on the windowsill. This was my life, physical evidence that I had not just survived but thrived in their absence. "This is Jasmine," I said, introducing my friend who stood protectively by my side. "Jasmine, these are Brian and Diana, my biological parents." The careful wording was intentional. They were my biological parents, but they had forfeited the right to any deeper meaning of the word parent long ago. "It's nice to meet you," Jasmine said, her tone professional but cool. "Ava, I'll be in the kitchen if you need me." She squeezed my arm reassuringly as she passed, leaving me alone with the ghosts of my past. "Please sit," I said, gesturing to the couch while I took the armchair opposite, maintaining distance both physical and emotional. They sat close together, my mother immediately reaching for my father's hand as if for support. The gesture struck me as odd. They had rarely displayed affection toward each other in my memory. "You look wonderful," my mother said, her eyes scanning me as if trying to memorize every detail. "So grown up, so confident." "I am confident," I replied. "I've had to be." My father's eyes dropped to the floor at that, a flash of what looked like shame crossing his face.
Ava,
He began, his voice unsteady.
we don't know where to begin. What we did, what I did, was unforgivable.
Yes, I agreed simply. It was. We've been looking for you for years, my mother said, leaning forward. When you first left, we thought you were just being dramatic, that you'd come back when you calmed down. Dramatic? I repeated the word, igniting a flash of the old anger. That's what you called it when I removed myself from a home where I was openly referred to as a mistake, where my existence was a punchline at a dinner party. They both flinched as if I'd slapped them. We were wrong, my father said, looking directly at me now. So wrong. It took losing you to realize what we had done, how we had treated our own daughter. My heart attack, he continued, gesturing to his chest, made me face my own mortality, made me think about what really matters. And all I could think about was finding you, telling you how sorry I am for everything. For every time I made you feel less than. For every opportunity I gave to Jackson but denied to you. For that horrible night when I betrayed you in the worst possible way. Tears were streaming down my mother's face now. We've been to therapy, she said, for years now, trying to understand how we could have been so cruel to our own child. The therapist says we were repeating patterns from our own childhoods, but that's no excuse. There is no excuse. I sat very still, processing their words. Part of me, the part that had been yearning for this moment since I was a child, wanted to collapse to accept their tears and apologies at face value. But the stronger part of me, the part that had been forged through pain and resilience, remained cautious. 6 years, I said quietly. It's been 6 years. I built a life from nothing. I worked my way through college. I changed my name legally because I couldn't bear to carry yours anymore. I did all of this without you because of you. We know, my father said, his voice breaking. Jackson has told us bits and pieces. He said you're successful, that you have a good job, that you're happy. I am happy, I confirmed. But it took years of therapy to undo the damage you caused. Years of fighting the voice in my head that told me I was worthless, unwanted, a mistake. Do you have any idea what that's like? To hear your own mother use your existence as a punchline? My mother sobbed openly, now her makeup streaking down her face. I hate myself for what I said, what I did. There hasn't been a day in the past 6 years that I haven't thought about it, haven't been sick with regret. Regret is easy when there are consequences, I said. Would you have felt this regret if I had stayed? If I had just absorbed that comment like I absorbed all the others over the years? Or would it have just been another Tuesday in the life of Ava, the family burden? We don't expect forgiveness, my father said, his voice steadier now. We don't deserve it. But we needed to see you, to tell you face to face how deeply sorry we are. To let you know that we understand now what we did, and that we will spend the rest of our lives trying to make amends if you'll allow it. I looked at them, these broken people sitting on my couch. The mighty figures from my childhood reduced to tears and regret. I felt a complex mix of emotions, pity, lingering anger, a strange sense of power, and underneath it all, a tentative hope that I immediately tried to suppress. I have questions, I said finally, and I need honest answers. They both nodded eagerly. Did you ever look for me at the youth shelter? They would have told you I was there if you had asked. They exchanged a glance, shame evident in their expressions. We called around to some shelters, my mother admitted, but we didn't pursue it aggressively. Brian was angry at first, thought you were just trying to punish us. And I was embarrassed, worried what people would think if they knew you had run away. The honesty was brutal, but confirmed what I had always suspected. Their pride had been more important than my welfare. Why now? I asked. Why after 6 years? The heart attack changed everything, my father said. When you're lying in a hospital bed thinking you might die, your priorities become very clear. All the excuses, all the justifications I had built up over the years crumbled away.
All I could think was that I might die without ever telling my daughter how sorry I am, without ever having the chance to try to make things right. I nodded, considering his words. "And you?" I asked, turning to my mother. "What changed for you?" She wiped at her tears, trying to compose herself. "When you first left, I was in denial. I told myself you were being rebellious, that you'd come home when you realized how hard the world is. But as weeks turned into months and then years, the reality set in. I had lost my daughter. My own child had found living on the streets preferable to living with us." She took a shuddering breath. "I started having these nightmares, terrible dreams, where you were hurt or in danger and I couldn't reach you. I started therapy, trying to understand how I had become the kind of mother whose child would rather be homeless than live with her. It's been a long, painful journey of self-examination." As they spoke, I noticed Jasmine quietly moving in the kitchen, making herself busy while still remaining within earshot, in case I needed her. Her presence anchored me, reminded me that regardless of how this conversation went, I was not alone. "I've built a family," I told them, my voice steady. "Not a biological one, but a chosen one. People who see me, value me, support me unconditionally. The kind of family I deserved all along." "We're glad," my father said, and to my surprise, he seemed sincere. "You deserve that and so much more. If you're expecting to just step back into my life to pick up where we left off," I said, "that's not going to happen. Too much damage has been done. Too many years have passed." "We don't expect that," my mother said quickly. "We just want whatever you're willing to give us, even if it's just knowing you're okay, knowing where you are." I considered them for a long moment. "I don't know what I want yet," I said honestly. "This is a lot to process. I need time." "Of course," my father said, nodding vigorously. "Of course. We've waited 6 years. We can wait however long you need." As if on cue, there was a knock at my door. I glanced at the clock and realized 20 minutes had indeed passed. That would be Karen and Rachel arriving as planned to provide additional support. "That's for me," I said, rising to answer it. When I opened the door, Karen and Rachel stood there, concern evident on their faces. "Right on time," I said, giving them a small, reassuring smile. They entered and I made introductions. "Brian, Diana, these are Karen and Rachel Lambert. They're my family." The significance of the last name wasn't lost on my parents, whose eyes widened slightly at the revelation that I had taken my former teacher's surname. "Lambert," my mother repeated softly. "Your English teacher." Rachel stepped forward, her expression guarded but professional. Yes, I was Ava's teacher. Now I'm proud to consider her family. The subtle emphasis on the word proud was deliberate, and I saw my father wince slightly. "We should go," he said, struggling a bit to rise from the couch. "We've taken enough of your time for today." I didn't stop them. As they moved toward the door, my mother turned back, hesitating as if she wanted to hug me but didn't dare try. "Could we?" she began tentatively. "Would it be possible to call you sometime or email?" I considered the request. "You can email me," I decided. "I'll send my address through Jackson." Relief washed over her face. It wasn't much, but it was something. As they stepped into the hallway, my father turned back one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, "for opening the door, for listening, for becoming the incredible person you are despite us rather than because of us." And then they were gone, leaving me standing in my apartment surrounded by the family I had chosen, the people who had helped me rebuild from the ashes of what my parents had burned down. "Are you okay?" Rachel asked, her arm around my shoulders. "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but I think I will be." That night, after everyone had gone and I was alone with Pepper curled on my lap, I sat by my window looking out at the city lights. 6 years ago, I had left with $40 and a backpack, convinced I was unworthy of love. Today, I had sat across from the people who had instilled that belief and felt, if not forgiveness, then at least a sense of closure. The family mistake had become a successful young woman with a career, a home, and people who genuinely cared about her. The journey had been harder than it should have been, But I had survived it. More than survived, I had thrived. And in doing so, I had proven that the only mistake had been theirs, not mine. I decided then that I would allow my parents limited conditional access to my life moving forward, not for their sake, but for mine. Not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. On my terms, at my pace, with my chosen family beside me every step of the way. They would never again have the power to define my worth. That power belonged to me now, and I would never surrender it again. Have you ever had to rebuild your sense of worth after someone tried to tear it down? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of survival and resilience. Share this with someone who might need to be reminded that their worth isn't determined by those who fail to see it. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, you are never a mistake regardless of what anyone tells you.